The land between two rivers. Before there were kingdoms, before there were kings, there was only the land, vast, open, and waiting. In the silence of the ancient world, two rivers carved their way across endless plains, winding through the heart of what would become the cradle of civilization. These were the Tigris and the Euphrates, the twin lifelines that carried water, silt, and the promise of life through a barren wilderness. Between them lay a land that would change everything. This was Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers. Long before the rise of Rome or the glory of Egypt, before the marble temples of Greece or the palaces of Persia, humanity's first great chapter began here. It was in this fertile crescent of earth and water that our ancestors learned to settle, to build, and to imagine a world beyond mere survival. The air here carried the scent of clay and grain, the soil, dark and rich, whispered of harvests yet to come. From the banks of these rivers, the first humans began to shape the earth not just with their hands, but with their minds. They gathered near the waters, building homes of mud and reeds that glimmered under the morning sun. For the first time in human history, people began to live not as wanderers, but as neighbors. They tilled the soil, tamed the floods, and learned to store the bounty of the land. They planted seeds, and in doing so, planted something far greater, the idea of civilization itself. Around their fires, stories began to take form. They spoke of gods and storms, of love and loss, of beginnings and ends. These stories would one day become the myths that defined them, the myths that still echo through the corridors of time. In Mesopotamia, life was both generous and cruel. The same rivers that brought abundance could also bring destruction. When the rains were too heavy, the waters rose, swallowing entire villages. When the sun burned too long, the earth cracked and thirsted for life. It was this delicate balance, between creation and destruction, that shaped the people who lived there. They learned to read the rhythms of nature, to build canals and dikes, to harness the strength of the rivers rather than fear them. And in that struggle, they found wisdom. But perhaps the most extraordinary thing about Mesopotamia was not what its people built, but what they began to believe. They looked at the stars and wondered who had placed them there. They listened to the wind and imagined voices of gods who governed the world beyond their reach. They molded clay tablets to keep record of their lives, of trade, harvests, and prayers. And on those fragile pieces of earth, humanity wrote its first words. From that moment, memory itself became immortal. Every city that would rise after, Uruk, Babylon, Nineveh, owed its existence to the first small clusters of homes built beside these rivers. Every law, every empire, every dream of progress can trace its roots back to the same fertile soil where the first farmers once bent their backs under the Mesopotamian sun. Mesopotamia was not just a birthplace of civilization, it was a mirror reflecting what it means to be human, to build, to believe, to fall, and to begin again. So tonight, as you listen and drift into the rhythm of the ancient world, imagine yourself standing on those warm plains thousands of years ago. Hear the slow murmur of the rivers, feel the dust beneath your feet, and watch the first sparks of civilization flicker in the fading light. This is where our story begins. This is the land between two rivers, the place where humanity opened its eyes for the very first time. Part 1: The Cradle of Civilization. Long before the word civilization had ever been spoken, the world was a vast wilderness of possibility. The earth was still young in its understanding of humanity, and humanity was still learning what it meant to belong to the earth. The great ice sheets of the last glacial age had retreated, leaving behind fertile plains and rich valleys where rivers carved their way through the soil. It was in these plains, where the Tigris and Euphrates met under the blazing sun, that humanity stumbled upon one of the most transformative discoveries in all of history, the ability to shape the land, to stay in one place, and to call that place home. This moment, though quiet and unrecorded, was the dawn of Mesopotamia, the first great experiment in what it meant to build a world. Life in these early river valleys was not easy. The climate was harsh, swinging between scorching heat and sudden floods that could wash away everything a family owned in a single night. Yet the people learned to adapt. They began to notice patterns in the chaos, the rising and falling of the rivers, the movement of the stars, the turning of the seasons. From those patterns came understanding, and from understanding came control. They dug canals to redirect the water, built dikes to protect their crops, and slowly transformed wild land into farmland. Each small act of survival was a quiet triumph, a whisper of civilization emerging from the wilderness. What makes this story extraordinary is that it was not guided by kings, empires, or even writing. It began with small communities of farmers who simply wanted to survive another season. Yet those same farmers would go on to shape human destiny. Their success with agriculture meant that, for the first time in history, people could grow more food than they needed. That surplus changed everything. It allowed some to become builders, others to become toolmakers, and a few to become storytellers, the first to wonder not just how to live, but why. As settlements grew, so did the complexity of life. Villages became towns, and towns slowly turned into cities. The first of these, places like Eridu and Uruk, rose from the plains like mirages of mud, brick, and faith. Their people constructed temples to honor gods they believed controlled the forces of nature, gods of water, sun, and wind, who demanded respect and offerings for the gift of survival. The ziggurat, the step temple that would come to define Mesopotamian architecture, was not merely a building, it was a bridge between earth and sky, a symbolic mountain linking humanity to the divine. When you look at these structures today, eroded and silent beneath the desert sun, you are seeing the physical embodiment of humanity's first attempt to touch eternity. The people of Mesopotamia did not just build cities, they built systems. They learned that order could emerge from chaos, that rules could protect life just as walls protected a city. Over time, they began to develop early forms of governance, assigning leaders, recording transactions, and resolving disputes. This was the birth of law, of organized religion, and of written language, all within a few centuries of one another. The invention of writing, perhaps the most profound creation of all, came not from poets or philosophers, but from accountants. Clay tablets found in the ruins of Uruk tell of grain deliveries, livestock counts, and trade exchanges, simple records that, over time, evolved into the complex written languages of Sumerian and Akkadian. With writing, memory itself became permanent. For the first time, knowledge could outlive the people who created it. But behind this progress lay tension. As cities grew and power consolidated, inequalities began to appear. Not everyone shared equally in the abundance of the rivers. Some held land, others worked it. Some spoke for the gods, while others offered sacrifices in fear and hope. The idea of hierarchy was born, and with it, the seeds of both civilization and conflict. Yet even in this imbalance, something extraordinary was taking shape. Humanity had begun to define itself not only by survival, but by imagination, by the ability to build meaning into the chaos of existence. The stories they told, carved into clay or whispered by firelight, reveal a people deeply aware of their place in the world. They saw themselves as caretakers of life, living between gods and nature, fragile yet significant. To understand Mesopotamia is to understand the human story itself. Every aspect of our modern world, cities, writing, law, trade, religion, government, can trace its roots back to these ancient lands. The wheel, irrigation, mathematics, and astronomy were all born here, not through sudden genius but through centuries of necessity. Mesopotamia was a world of constant challenge, and challenge breeds innovation. When the floods destroyed their fields, they built canals. When droughts came, they learned to store water. When the harvests failed, they developed trade routes that connected them to distant peoples. Each obstacle became an opportunity to think, to adapt, to endure. And yet, for all their brilliance, the people of ancient Mesopotamia were haunted by the fragility of their world. They knew that the same rivers that gave them life could just as easily take it away. Their myths reflect this delicate balance between creation and destruction. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the world's oldest surviving stories, the gods sent a great flood to cleanse the earth of human arrogance, a tale echoed thousands of years later in other cultures and religions. The Mesopotamians did not believe they were masters of nature. They believed they were partners in a delicate dance, dependent on forces far greater than themselves. Walking through the ruins of Ur or Babylon today, one can almost feel the ghosts of those early lives lingering in the dust, the farmers who prayed for rain, the scribes who etched symbols into clay, the builders who raised their temples toward the heavens. Each of them, in their own way, was part of the same vast human experiment, to bring order, meaning, and permanence to a world that was constantly shifting. They did not know that they were creating civilization. They only knew they were surviving, one season at a time. But from that survival came greatness. The Fertile Crescent blossomed into a network of trade and culture that stretched far beyond its rivers. Ideas traveled along with goods, metallurgy, art, religion, and language, binding the ancient world into something that resembled the earliest form of globalization. People in distant lands began to imitate Mesopotamian writing and architecture, carrying its influence across continents. In many ways, the spirit of Mesopotamia became the blueprint for all civilizations that followed. Yet time, as always, would test everything they built. Floods, droughts, invasions, and internal strife would rise like storms over the centuries. Empires such as Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria would rise and fall, each leaving their own mark upon the land. But even as the names changed, the foundation remained, the knowledge that human effort could bend the will of nature, and that through cooperation and imagination, even the harshest land could be transformed into a thriving world. In the end, Mesopotamia is not just a place in history, it is a mirror. It reflects who we were, and who we still are. It shows us that civilization is not a single achievement, but a fragile thread woven through countless generations. Every time we build, organize, or create, we are echoing those first hands that shaped the mud along the rivers of Sumer. Every law written, every city planned, every story told, carries within it a fragment of that ancient world. As the night deepens and you imagine those vast plains under starlight, try to picture the flickering glow of oil lamps in a city that no longer exists. Somewhere in the distance, a priest stands before a ziggurat, offering grain to the gods. A mother hums softly to her child as the wind carries the scent of wet earth after a flood. The sound of a reed flute drifts through the streets. In that moment, thousands of years ago, life was as full and as fragile as it is now. This was the cradle of civilization, the birthplace of humanity's grandest experiment. And as we drift deeper into the story of Mesopotamia, we will begin to see not only how these people lived, but how they dreamed, how they saw the world, the gods, and themselves. Their story is our story, written not in ink, but in clay, soil, and memory. Part 2, Sumer, the first cities of the world. When the dust of the early world began to settle, and the first humans learned to tame the chaos of their surroundings, a new sound began to echo across the plains of southern Mesopotamia, the rhythmic heartbeat of civilization itself. This was the land of Sumer, a region where rivers met the sea, where the soil was dark with promise, and where humanity first began to understand the true meaning of progress. Long before Egypt raised its pyramids or Greece built its temples, the Sumerians were already living in organized cities, crafting tools, telling stories, and inventing the systems that would define what it meant to be human. To imagine Sumer is to imagine a landscape unlike any other, vast, fertile, and unpredictable. The Tigris and Euphrates Rivers carried both blessing and danger, flooding the plains with rich silt one season and destruction the next. It was this cycle of chaos and renewal that shaped the Sumerian mind. They learned that survival depended not on strength, but on cooperation and ingenuity. With simple tools and great patience, they began to dig irrigation canals, creating networks of water that transformed wild land into productive farmland. Over generations, these canals became lifelines, sustaining entire communities. From this mastery of water came something revolutionary: stability. For the first time, people could live in one place for generations, bound not by the uncertainty of nature, but by the shared rhythm of the rivers. With stability came growth. Small farming villages gradually merged into larger settlements, each one connected by trade and tradition. And then, something remarkable happened: these settlements became cities. Among them were names that would echo across history: Eridu, often called the world's first city; Ur, a city of power and wealth; Uruk, the birthplace of writing and urban life; and Lagash, a center of trade and governance. Each of these cities was a marvel of early human organization, a cluster of homes, workshops, temples, and markets, all bound by walls that symbolized the people's collective will to endure. At the heart of every Sumerian city stood its ziggurat, a towering step structure that reached toward the heavens. These were not just temples, they were the axis of the Sumerian world, connecting the mortal and divine. The ziggurat was a statement that humanity, though fragile and finite, could aspire to touch the sky. Priests, dressed in ceremonial robes, would climb its stairways to offer prayers and sacrifices to their gods, deities who ruled over every aspect of life, from the flow of rivers to the fate of kings. Among them were Anu, the god of the heavens, Enlil, the god of air and storms, Inanna, the goddess of love and war, and Enki, the god of wisdom and water. These gods were not distant abstractions. They lived in every gust of wind, every harvest, every victory, and every loss. The Sumerians believed the gods had shaped them from clay to serve a divine purpose, to work the land, maintain order, and honor the sacred balance of creation. Life was both a gift and a duty. Every harvest, every ritual, every festival was a conversation with the gods, a reminder that humans existed not as masters of the world, but as caretakers. This worldview shaped everything they built, everything they wrote, and everything they dreamed. But beyond faith, Sumer was defined by innovation. Here, the first known writing system, cuneiform, was born. What began as simple marks on clay tablets used to record grain and livestock grew into a complex language capable of expressing trade, law, literature, and philosophy. The wedge-shaped impressions pressed by a stylus were more than symbols, they were the first attempt to capture human thought in permanent form. Through cuneiform, the Sumerians recorded their myths, laws, and history, giving us a window into their world thousands of years later. Among these writings, none is more famous than the Epic of Gilgamesh, a tale that explores the deepest human questions, mortality, friendship, and the search for meaning. In Uruk, one of the greatest Sumerian cities, the figure of Gilgamesh was both a legend and a symbol. He was said to be 2/3 god and 1/3 man, a king of unmatched power who sought to defy death itself. His story, written in clay thousands of years before the Bible or Homer's epics, speaks to something timeless, humanity's restless desire to understand the purpose of life. The Sumerians, through Gilgamesh, gave us the first written reflection on the fragility of existence, a reminder that even the mightiest must one day return to the dust from which they came. But life in Sumer was not only about gods and heroes. It was also about the simple, everyday rhythm of human survival. The Sumerians were farmers, craftsmen, traders, and dreamers. Their cities hummed with activity, markets filled with grain, wool, pottery, and copper, workshops echoing with the ring of hammers, canals alive with boats carrying goods from one city to another. Trade connected Sumer to distant lands, with the mountains of Iran for metals, the deserts of Arabia for stones, and even the Indus Valley for precious materials. In this network of exchange, the seeds of international trade were sown, linking distant peoples in the world's first web of commerce. Within the city walls, social order took shape. Society was divided into classes, priests and rulers at the top, followed by merchants, craftsmen, and laborers. At the bottom were slaves, often prisoners of war or debtors, who worked the fields and temples. This hierarchy reflected the belief that order mirrored the cosmos, every person had a place, just as every god had a role in the heavens. Yet even within this rigid system, the Sumerians showed remarkable pragmatism. Their laws, recorded in early legal codes, sought to regulate trade, property, and family life. Justice, though harsh by modern standards, was seen as a sacred duty, the foundation upon which civilization could stand. The government of Sumerian cities was centered around the temple and the palace, two powers that often worked hand in hand. The temple was the heart of economic life, managing land, labor, and storage. Priests were not just religious figures, they were administrators, scholars, and keepers of knowledge. The palace, led by a lugul, a king or big man, represented authority and defense. Over time, as cities competed for resources, these rulers became increasingly powerful, transforming from caretakers into conquerors. The rise of kingship was inevitable in a land where survival required strength and coordination. And so, for the first time, the idea of political power, of rulers chosen by divine will, took root in human consciousness. As cities expanded and rivalries grew, war became a constant shadow over the land. Armies clashed over water rights, territory, and trade routes. Walls grew higher, and weapons grew sharper. Yet even in war, the Sumerians left behind evidence of their sophistication. They organized armies, developed strategies, and crafted weapons of bronze, the metal that defined an age. The image of the Sumerian phalanx, shields interlocked, marching across the plains, was a sign that humanity had entered a new stage, the era of organized conflict, where the fate of civilizations could be decided not by nature, but by men. Despite the constant tension, there was also beauty, a flourishing of art, music, and literature that reflected the richness of Sumerian life. They carved intricate cylinder seals used to sign documents, painted ceramics with patterns of harmony and order, and composed hymns to the gods that blended devotion with poetry. Their musicians played lyres and flutes, filling the air with songs of harvest, love, and prayer. In their art, one can see both the sophistication of a people deeply connected to their world and the longing of a civilization aware of its fragility. Over centuries, Sumer became a beacon of progress, influencing every culture that followed. But even as it thrived, the forces of time and change began to stir. The rivers that once nurtured Sumer also brought floods that destroyed fields. The soil, overworked and salted by irrigation, began to lose its fertility. Rival cities weakened each other through endless wars. And as the strength of Sumer waned, new powers began to rise in the north. The Akkadians, a Semitic people who admired Sumer's achievements but sought to rule them under one banner. The fall of Sumer was not a single event but a slow fading, like the dimming of an ancient fire. Yet its legacy endured. Every culture that came after, Akkad, Babylon, Assyria, and even Persia, built upon its foundation. Writing, law, religion, and governance all trace their lineage back to these early cities of mud and dreams. The Sumerians may have vanished from history, but the world they created never truly disappeared. When we think of the modern world, of cities lit by electricity, of laws written in courts, of languages that carry our thoughts, we are, in a sense, still walking the streets of Uruk and Ur. The same curiosity that drove the Sumerians to shape clay and record their thoughts drives us to explore the stars. Their story is our story, written in the deep memory of civilization. And so, as the night deepens, imagine yourself standing on the banks of the Euphrates under a sky filled with ancient stars. The air is warm, the scent of wet clay and oil lamps drifts through the city, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of a lyre echoes through the temple courtyards. A priest offers prayers to Inanna, a scribe etches symbols into clay, and a mother tells her child the story of Gilgamesh. Life moves with a steady rhythm, as it did thousands of years ago. And in that rhythm lies the heart of Sumer, the world's first civilization, and the first dream of what humanity could become. Part 3, The Rise of Akkad, the world's first empire. By the time the cities of Sumer had reached their height, the world had already begun to change. The great plains that once echoed with the sounds of harvest and song now carried the distant rumble of armies. The land between the rivers, once a cradle of cooperation, had become a chessboard of ambition. Each city sought dominance over the others, and their endless rivalries slowly drained the life from the land. Amid this struggle, a new power began to stir in the north, a power that would unite the fractured cities under one banner and forever alter the course of human history. This was Akkad, and from its heart rose a man whose name would be remembered for millennia, Sargon of Akkad, the first true emperor the world had ever known. The story of Sargon begins not in palaces or temples, but in obscurity. According to ancient legends, he was born the son of a humble water carrier. His mother, unable to care for him, placed him in a basket and set him adrift upon the river. The currents carried the child downstream until he was found by a gardener who raised him as his own. From these modest beginnings, Sargon would rise to become one of history's most formidable leaders, a man who transformed the scattered city-states of Mesopotamia into a single, united empire. Whether this tale is fact or myth hardly matters, for it captures what the Akkadians themselves believed about destiny, that greatness can emerge from the most unlikely of places, and that even the flow of rivers can carry a man toward his fate. Akkad itself was a city shrouded in mystery. Unlike Uruk or Ur, its ruins have never been definitively located, leaving its exact site lost to time. Yet from inscriptions and ancient tablets, we know it was a city of immense power and influence, a center of administration, trade, and culture that bridged the northern and southern regions of Mesopotamia. It was here that the Akkadian language, a Semitic tongue distinct from the older Sumerian, began to dominate. Over time, it became the lingua franca of the ancient Near East, the first true international language in history. Through Akkad, words and ideas flowed as freely as goods along the rivers, the first whispers of cultural globalization. Sargon's ascent to power was as strategic as it was ambitious. He began as a servant of the Sumerian king of Kish, one of the great city-states of the time. But through cunning, loyalty, and perhaps a touch of destiny, he overthrew his master and claimed the throne for himself. From there, he set his sights on the rest of Sumer. One by one, the great cities fell before his armies: Uruk, Uar, Lagash, and Eridu, their walls breached, their kings humbled. Yet Sargon was not merely a conqueror, he was a unifier. He understood that to rule such a vast and diverse land, force alone would not suffice. He built a system of administration that balanced power and loyalty, placing trusted governors, often members of his own family, in charge of conquered cities. He respected local customs and gods, blending them into a broader imperial framework that allowed the people to see themselves not as subjects of a foreign ruler, but as citizens of a new, greater world. Under Sargon's rule, Akkad became the center of an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. Never before had so many different peoples, languages, and cultures been brought under a single authority. The concept of empire, of a vast realm ruled by one central power, was born here, in the dust and heat of ancient Mesopotamia. With it came the first notions of bureaucracy, diplomacy, and large-scale governance. Clay tablets from the time describe an intricate network of officials, messengers, and scribes who maintained order across the empire, ensuring that Sargon's will was known from the mountains to the sea. But empire, as history would forever prove, is both a triumph and a burden. The Akkadians brought peace, trade, and prosperity to the lands they conquered, but they also inherited the fragility of the world they had subdued. The same rivers that nourished their fields could turn against them, the same gods that had blessed them could grow silent. The Akkadian Empire thrived on balance, between strength and mercy, control and freedom, ambition and humility. For a time, that balance held. Under Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, the empire reached its zenith. Naram-Sin was not content to merely preserve his grandfather's conquests, he sought to expand them. His armies marched north into Anatolia, east into Elam, and west toward the Levant. His victories were so numerous, his power so absolute, that he took the unprecedented step of declaring himself a god, the first ruler in history to do so. In a famous inscription, he is depicted wearing the horned crown of divinity, leading his soldiers up a mountain as enemies fall before him. To the Akkadians, this was the image of divine kingship, a mortal elevated by the gods to preserve cosmic order. But divine ambition carries divine risk. The Sumerians believed that pride, hubris, was among the greatest sins a ruler could commit, for it disturbed the delicate balance between heaven and earth. And in the years following Naram-Sin's reign, the empire began to falter. Drought struck the land, turning fertile plains into dust. The once reliable rivers shrank, their waters receding as the climate grew harsher. Crops failed. Trade routes collapsed, and famine spread. The Akkadians, dependent on the delicate systems they had built, found themselves powerless before the wrath of nature. As internal strife grew, external threats gathered at the borders. From the northern mountains came a people the Akkadians called the Gutians, tribes of fierce, nomadic warriors who descended upon the weakened empire. The Akkadian armies, already stretched thin, could not withstand the onslaught. City after city fell, and the empire that had once seemed eternal began to crumble. Within a century of Sargon's rise, the world's first empire had vanished, swallowed by the same land that had given it birth. The fall of Akkad left behind not only ruins but lessons. Future civilizations would study its rise and fall, learning that empire is as fragile as the people who build it. The Sumerians, who survived in smaller city-states after Akkad's collapse, viewed the Gutian invasion as divine punishment, a warning from the gods that even the greatest rulers must remain humble before forces greater than themselves. The memory of Sargon and Naram-Sin lived on, carved into stone and sung in lamentations that echoed for centuries. To later kings, they were both models and warnings, symbols of ambition's heights and downfall's inevitability. Yet from the ashes of Akkad came renewal. The Akkadian language continued to flourish, becoming the language of diplomacy and scholarship for more than 1,000 years. The administrative systems pioneered by Sargon became templates for future empires, from Babylon to Persia. Even the idea of divine kingship, the notion that rulers were chosen by the gods to uphold order, would echo through history, shaping the beliefs of pharaohs, emperors, and kings across the ancient world. Akkad may have fallen, but its shadow stretched across millennia. When we reflect on the Akkadian Empire, we see the first great cycle of civilization: rise, glory, decline, and rebirth. It is a pattern that would repeat endlessly in human history. Sargon's dream of unity was bold, but it revealed an eternal truth, that power, like the rivers of Mesopotamia, must constantly flow, or it begins to dry. The empire that once united the land between two rivers would give way to new powers, new ideas, and new dreams. As the stars rise over the Mesopotamian plain, one can almost imagine the ghost of Sargon standing upon the walls of Akkad, looking out over his empire as the wind carries the scent of dust and memory. The rivers glimmer faintly in the moonlight, the same rivers that once bore his cradle and his crown. The empire may have faded, but the idea it birthed, the dream of unity, ambition, and legacy, still flows within us. And so, the world turns once more, carrying us from the age of Akkad into the dawn of a new power, one that would redefine the ancient world and carve its name into eternity: Babylon. Part 4, Babylon, the City of Gods and Kings. When the dust of Akkad's fall finally settled, what remained was not silence, but renewal. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates was too fertile, too deeply carved by human hands and hope, to stay still for long. The people who had lived through the storms of empire, the farmers, the merchants, the scribes, began to rebuild. Out of this long twilight, one city would rise to surpass all others. It would become a symbol of grandeur, wisdom, and power, a name that even today carries the weight of legend. That city was Babylon. Babylon began humbly. In the shadow of Akkad's ruins, it was once just another small settlement along the river, unremarkable compared to the great cities of Ur or Kish. But its location was destiny. It sat at the crossroads of trade routes that connected north and south, east and west, where caravans of copper and lapis lazuli passed through, and where the languages of many lands mixed like currents in a river. Over time, these paths would bring not only goods, but ideas, new forms of writing, architecture, governance, and belief. And slowly, the small settlement grew into something extraordinary. The early centuries of Babylon's story were marked by struggle. The Gutian invasion had left Mesopotamia fractured, and for generations, city-states fought over dominance. But one man would eventually emerge to transform Babylon from a mere city into the beating heart of a new civilization. His name was Hammurabi, a king whose reign would forever shape human history. Hammurabi came to the throne around 1792 BCE, inheriting a modest kingdom surrounded by rivals. To the north lay Assyria, fierce and ambitious; to the south, the ancient cities of Sumer still clung to independence. To survive, Hammurabi would need to be both a warrior and a diplomat, a strategist and a statesman. And that is exactly what he became. For the first years of his reign, Hammurabi strengthened his city from within. He repaired canals, expanded temples, and ensured that Babylon's people were well-fed and loyal. Water, in Mesopotamia, was life. Whoever controlled the rivers, controlled everything. Hammurabi understood this deeply. He launched massive irrigation projects, building new dikes and reservoirs that transformed the arid land into a network of fertile fields. As harvests flourished, so did trade, and as trade grew, so did Babylon's wealth. But Hammurabi's true genius lay in his ability to turn opportunity into empire. Through alliances, treaties, and at times ruthless campaigns, he slowly extended his influence over neighboring states. One by one, rival kings fell, some by sword, others by oath. By the end of his reign, Babylon had become the center of the known world, and Hammurabi its unquestioned master. For the first time since Sargon of Akkad, Mesopotamia was united under a single ruler. Yet Hammurabi's greatest legacy was not conquest, but law. The Code of Hammurabi stands as one of the earliest and most comprehensive legal systems in human history. Carved into a tall basalt stele, it contained nearly 300 laws governing every aspect of life, from trade and property to marriage, wages, and crime. To bring about the rule of righteousness in the land, the inscription reads, to destroy the wicked and the evildoers, so that the strong should not harm the weak. It was a vision of justice that still echoes through time. The laws were clear and often severe. They followed the principle of lex talionis, the law of retaliation. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But beyond their harshness lay a profound truth. For the first time, law was written down for all to see. Justice was no longer the whim of kings or priests, it was an institution, a standard that even rulers were meant to uphold. This was the foundation of civilization itself, the idea that order must be built upon fairness, not fear. Hammurabi's Babylon was not only a place of governance but of culture and beauty. Towering temples, known as ziggurats, reached toward the heavens, massive, stepped structures dedicated to the gods who watched over the city. The most sacred among them was the Etemenenki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, believed by later generations to be the inspiration for the biblical Tower of Babel. From its summit, priests studied the stars, charting the movements of the heavens, seeking messages from the divine. In these early observations lay the roots of astronomy, mathematics, and the human desire to understand the cosmos. Life in Babylon was a blend of discipline and devotion. The markets bustled with traders selling wool, spices, and grain. The air was thick with the scent of incense and baked clay. Scribes hunched over tablets, pressing wedge-shaped cuneiform into wet clay with reed styluses, recording everything from business transactions to poetry. Music drifted through the streets, the sound of lyres, flutes, and drums played during religious festivals. The Babylonians celebrated not only their gods but the very rhythm of existence, the cycles of planting and harvest, birth and death, the eternal dance of day and night. At the heart of Babylonian belief stood Marduk, the city's patron god. He was the embodiment of order, the divine champion who, according to myth, defeated the chaos dragon Tiamat and brought harmony to the cosmos. In Marduk's victory, the Babylonians saw a reflection of their own civilization, the triumph of structure over chaos, of law over disorder. Each new year, a grand festival known as the Akitas celebrated this victory anew. The statue of Marduk was paraded through the city, as priests and citizens alike reaffirmed their faith in the balance that sustained their world. Hammurabi's empire flourished for decades, but like all empires, it too faced decline. After his death, weaker rulers struggled to maintain control. The unity he had built began to fragment as old rivalries re-emerged. In time, Babylon was conquered, first by the Hittites, then by the Kassites, and later by the Assyrians. Yet the city never truly died. It endured, rebuilt and reborn time and again, like a phoenix rising from its own ashes. Centuries passed, and Babylon's power waxed and waned with the tides of history. But it was in the 6th century BCE, under the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II, that Babylon would reach its ultimate glory, a city so magnificent that its name became synonymous with splendor itself. Nebuchadnezzar II was a ruler of vision and pride. He expanded Babylon into an empire that rivaled even Hammurabi's, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Egypt. His reign was marked by monumental architecture, walls, temples, and palaces that defied imagination. It was said that the city's walls were so wide that chariots could race along them side by side. And towering above it all stood the legendary Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. According to ancient writers, the gardens were built for Nebuchadnezzar's queen, Amytis, who longed for the green hills of her homeland. To ease her sorrow, the king ordered the creation of an artificial mountain of terraces, each filled with lush vegetation, trees, flowers, and vines cascading down in fragrant waves. Ingenious irrigation systems carried water from the Euphrates to nourish the gardens, making them bloom in the heart of the desert. Whether myth or reality, the image of those gardens, a paradise built by human hands, has captivated imaginations for over 2 millennia. But beneath the grandeur, Babylon's story remained bound to its greatest paradox, the tension between creation and destruction. For even as Nebuchadnezzar built his wonders, he waged wars across the Near East, conquering Jerusalem and exiling its people. To them, Babylon became a symbol of oppression, a city of arrogance and sin, the whore of Babylon, condemned in later scripture. Yet to others, it remained a beacon of human achievement, a testament to what civilization could achieve when guided by ambition and intellect. In its final centuries, Babylon stood as both a marvel and a warning. The Persian king Cyrus the Great would eventually march through its gates without battle, declaring himself not its destroyer but its liberator. He respected Babylon's gods, its temples, and its traditions, ensuring that the city's spirit lived on. But with the rise of Persia, the age of Babylonian dominance came to an end. The rivers still flowed, the ziggurats still touched the sky, but the heartbeat of empire had shifted. And yet, Babylon never truly vanished. Its name survived through the ages, in stories, in faith, in language. To the Greeks, it was the city of wonders; to the Hebrews, a symbol of exile and longing; to historians, the mirror of humanity's highest dreams and deepest flaws. Its ruins, buried beneath centuries of dust, would one day be uncovered by archaeologists who marveled at the sophistication of its walls, the artistry of its inscriptions, and the enduring brilliance of its laws. In the quiet night of history, Babylon still whispers, of kings and conquerors, of love and loss, of the eternal quest to create something that lasts beyond one's lifetime. It reminds us that every civilization, no matter how mighty, is built on the fragile foundation of human hope. And though its towers have fallen and its gardens turned to dust, the spirit of Babylon endures, in every city that reaches for the heavens, in every law that seeks justice, and in every dream that refuses to die. As the torch of civilization passes once more, we move northward, toward the iron-willed conquerors who learned from Babylon's rise and fall, and who would wield its lessons to build something even greater. The next chapter of our journey leads us into the land of Assyria, the empire of iron, conquest, and fear. Part 5, Assyria, the empire of iron and fear. After the glory of Babylon began to fade, a new power stirred in the northern plains of Mesopotamia, a power forged not in peace and abundance, but in hardship and endurance. Far from the fertile marshes and calm rivers of the south, this land was harsher, more rugged, and less forgiving. Winters were cold, summers dry, and survival demanded discipline. The people who lived here were shaped by their landscape, resilient, fierce, and unyielding. These were the Assyrians, and in time, they would build one of the most formidable empires the ancient world had ever seen. Assyria began as a small collection of settlements near the upper Tigris River, around a city called Assur, which would later lend its name to both the people and their god. While the Sumerians and Babylonians looked to the gentle cycles of planting and harvest, the Assyrians looked to the horizon, to conquest and expansion. Their environment did not offer the easy wealth of southern Mesopotamia, and so they learned to take what they needed, through trade, through alliance, and eventually, through force. What began as a modest city-state would, over the centuries, evolve into a war machine whose name would echo in terror across the ancient Near East. The early Assyrians were not yet conquerors. Like their southern neighbors, they worshipped a pantheon of gods, traded goods along the Tigris, and recorded their lives on clay tablets in the cuneiform script inherited from Sumer. But slowly, their ambitions grew. The constant pressure of hostile neighbors, the Hurrians to the north, the Babylonians to the south, forced them to develop one of the most disciplined military systems of their age. By around 1300 BCE, Assyria began its transformation under the leadership of Ashur-uballit, who asserted independence from the fading Babylonian Empire and proclaimed Assyria a kingdom in its own right. Over the following centuries, a succession of rulers expanded Assyrian territory through relentless warfare. Cities like Nineveh, Nimrud, and Calhu became strongholds of power, their walls bristling with towers and gates, their palaces decorated with vast reliefs showing kings hunting lions or crushing enemies beneath their chariots. The Assyrians saw war not only as necessity but as destiny. Their god Ashur demanded victory, and to fight in his name was a sacred duty. Every campaign, every conquest, was both a military act and a form of worship. Assyria's rise was defined by its mastery of organization. While earlier empires had relied on loosely bound alliances, the Assyrians built a centralized system that combined efficient administration with ruthless control. They developed an advanced infrastructure of roads and communication, a network that allowed messages and supplies to travel quickly across vast distances. This was the lifeblood of empire. From their capital, kings could command armies hundreds of miles away and receive reports from distant governors within days. It was, in a sense, the world's first great bureaucracy, a model that would inspire future empires from Persia to Rome. But the heart of Assyria's power lay in its military innovation. They were among the first to fully harness the potential of iron weapons, giving them a decisive advantage over their bronze-armed foes. Their armies were highly trained and meticulously organized, with infantry, cavalry, and siege engineers working together in disciplined formations. They perfected the art of siege warfare, using battering rams, towers, and sappers to breach even the strongest city walls. And where others hesitated, they advanced, driven by a combination of strategy, brutality, and unwavering confidence. To those they conquered, the Assyrians were both feared and admired. Their inscriptions and reliefs boast of conquests with chilling precision. Kings like Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, Sennacherib, and Ashurbanipal waged campaigns that stretched from the mountains of Anatolia to the deserts of Arabia, from the coasts of the Mediterranean to the valleys of Iran. Entire nations fell before them. Cities that resisted were destroyed, their inhabitants deported or enslaved. It was a deliberate policy of terror, psychological warfare designed to ensure obedience without constant rebellion. But behind this reputation for cruelty lay something more complex. The Assyrians were not merely destroyers, they were also builders, administrators, and visionaries. They resettled populations to integrate conquered peoples into the empire, spreading ideas, technologies, and cultures across regions. They built magnificent capitals, each grander than the last, adorned with temples, gardens, and colossal gates guarded by lamassu, winged bulls with human faces meant to ward off evil. Their artistry, though born in violence, expressed an extraordinary refinement and attention to detail. Under Ashurbanipal, who ruled in the 7th century BCE, Assyria reached the peak of its power and sophistication. His capital, Nineveh, became one of the largest cities in the world, home to towering palaces and bustling markets. But perhaps Ashurbanipal's most enduring achievement was not military but intellectual, the creation of the Library of Nineveh. Within its walls lay over 30,000 clay tablets containing texts on history, science, medicine, mathematics, and myth. It was the first great library of the ancient world, a treasure house of knowledge that preserved the wisdom of centuries. Through these tablets, future generations would rediscover the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest surviving story known to humankind. Ashurbanipal saw himself as both scholar and warrior, a ruler who could command armies by day and debate philosophy by night. In his inscriptions, he boasts of reading obscure Sumerian texts and mastering the difficult art of writing, a rare achievement for a king. His reign symbolized the dual nature of Assyria itself, intellect bound to iron, culture balanced on the edge of conquest. Yet beneath this brilliance lay the seeds of collapse. Empires built on fear seldom last. The same ruthless efficiency that made Assyria powerful also made it fragile. Conquered peoples obeyed out of terror, not loyalty, and the vast territories stretched Assyria's resources thin. Rebellions flared constantly, draining manpower and wealth. When combined forces of Babylonians and Medes finally rose against them, the mighty Assyrian war machine could no longer hold. In 612 BCE, the unthinkable happened, Nineveh fell. The once great capital, jewel of the empire, was besieged and destroyed. Fire consumed its palaces, and the Tigris ran red with the blood of its defenders. So complete was the ruin that for centuries afterward, Nineveh's location was forgotten, its name surviving only in whispers and legends. To later civilizations, its downfall became a symbol of divine justice, the inevitable punishment of arrogance and cruelty. And yet, even in ruin, Assyria's legacy endured. Its methods of administration, military discipline, and cultural integration would influence every empire that followed. The Persians adopted their system of provinces and governors, the Romans would inherit their logistical genius. The Assyrians had shown that empire was not merely a matter of conquest but of management, that to rule the world, one needed not only the sword, but the system to wield it. But beyond their innovations, Assyria left something far deeper, a haunting lesson about power itself. They proved that civilization and brutality are not opposites but twins, often born of the same ambition. The same hands that carved the lamassu also wrote the records of massacres. The same minds that preserved ancient wisdom also devised instruments of terror. Assyria was humanity's reflection in the mirror of history, magnificent and monstrous all at once. When archaeologists in the 19th century uncovered the ruins of Nineveh, they found the remains of this paradox frozen in clay. The relief still showed kings hunting lions, chariots thundering across battlefields, soldiers raising their banners beneath the wings of gods. But alongside them lay tablets filled with hymns, prayers, and poetry, words of devotion and wonder. It was as if the empire's soul, divided between cruelty and beauty, had tried to speak one final time through the dust. Today, as we look back on Assyria's rise and fall, it stands as both inspiration and warning. The empire of iron and fear conquered the world, but it could not conquer time. Its cities turned to ruins, its language faded, and its power dissolved into memory. Yet its echoes remain in every library, every law, every organized government that traces its roots to the ancient Near East. And so, as the fires of Assyria burn out across the horizon of history, another power begins to rise, one that will learn from the mistakes of its predecessors and seek to rule not through terror, but through unity and faith. In the next chapter, we journey eastward, to a people who would take the legacy of Babylon and Assyria and forge it into something greater, something lasting, the Empire of Persia, the realm of kings and immortals. Part 6, Persia, the Birth of Empire. Empires rise from the ashes of others. In the wake of Assyria's fall and Babylon's fading brilliance, the lands of the ancient Near East were once again divided. The great cities had burned, and the world seemed tired of conquest, weary of the endless cycle of kings who built their thrones on blood. Yet beyond the Zagros Mountains, where the sun cast its first light on the eastern plains, a new power was stirring. From the quiet highlands of Anshan, a people once overlooked by their mightier neighbors began to gather strength. They were the Persians, and soon, they would change the course of history forever. At first, they were hardly noticed. The Persians were a small tribe among many, descendants of Indo-European nomads who had migrated south centuries earlier, settling in the harsh plateaus of what is now Iran. Life here demanded endurance. The soil was thin, the summers scorching, and the winters unforgiving. But hardship bred unity, and unity bred ambition. The Persians learned to survive not through wealth or luxury, but through loyalty, to clan, to kin, and to the idea that their destiny stretched beyond their borders. Their earliest kings ruled small territories under the shadow of more powerful neighbors, the Medes to the north and east, the remnants of Babylon to the west. For generations, the Persians served as vassals, paying tribute, bowing before the Median kings, and biding their time. But that patience would end with the rise of a single man, a man who would turn vassalage into vengeance, and obedience into empire. His name was Cyrus, remembered by history as Cyrus the Great. Cyrus's rise began around 550 BCE. The stories tell that he was born under prophecy, that his grandfather, the Median king Astyages, had dreamt of a vine growing from his daughter that would cover the entire world. Fearing this omen, Astyages ordered the infant killed. But as so often happens in the stories of destiny, mercy intervened. The baby was spared, hidden among shepherds, and raised in obscurity until the time was right. When he came of age, Cyrus led a revolt against the Medes, toppling his grandfather's rule and uniting the Medes and Persians under one banner. In this union, he laid the foundation of what would become the Achaemenid Empire, the largest and most enduring empire the world had ever seen. Cyrus's genius lay not only in conquest but in compassion. Unlike the Assyrians, who ruled through terror, or the Babylonians, who imposed rigid control, Cyrus understood that empire required more than domination, it required belief. He offered conquered peoples something new: respect, tolerance, and stability. When his armies entered Babylon in 539 BCE, there was no massacre, no burning of temples. Instead, Cyrus declared himself chosen by the god Marduk to restore order and peace. He freed the enslaved, rebuilt shrines, and allowed exiled peoples, including the Jews, to return to their homelands. His Cyrus cylinder, often called the world's first declaration of human rights, proclaimed freedom of worship and the restoration of dignity to all nations under his rule. Under Cyrus, the Persian Empire stretched from the Aegean Sea to the mountains of Central Asia, a vast mosaic of cultures, languages, and gods. But it was not ruled as a single monolith. Instead, Cyrus introduced a revolutionary system of governance, the satrapy. Each region, or satrapy, was administered by a governor, a satrap, who oversaw taxes, justice, and military affairs, while remaining loyal to the great king. This balance of local autonomy and centralized power became the backbone of Persian rule. It allowed the empire to function not as a conquered land but as a living organism, flexible, enduring, and remarkably stable. When Cyrus died, the empire mourned him not as a tyrant, but as a father. His tomb still stands in Pasargadae, a simple stone structure set against the endless Persian plain. Even Alexander the Great, centuries later, would visit it and bow his head in reverence. For Cyrus had built more than an empire, he had built an idea, that power need not destroy, that greatness could coexist with mercy. After his death, his son Cambyses too inherited the throne. Where his father had ruled with grace, Cambyses ruled with obsession. His ambition drove him southward, into Egypt, where he sought to add the kingdom of the pharaohs to Persia's crown. His campaigns were brutal but successful, and for the first time in history, the Nile and the Euphrates flowed under a single empire. Yet Cambyses's reign was marked by paranoia and instability. Rumors of madness surrounded him, whispers that he desecrated temples, defied the gods, and killed his own brother in a fit of rage. Whether truth or propaganda, his image became one of chaos, and when he died under mysterious circumstances, the empire teetered on the edge of collapse. Into that vacuum stepped one of history's greatest administrators and visionaries, Darius I, known to history as Darius the Great. His ascent to power was not smooth. He seized the throne through cunning and force after suppressing revolts that spread like wildfire across the empire. But once he secured his position, he began to reshape Persia into something far greater than Cyrus could have imagined. Darius was an organizer, a builder, a thinker. He saw the empire not as a patchwork of lands but as a single body in need of order. He divided it into 20 satrapies, each carefully taxed and monitored. He introduced a standardized system of weights and measures, minted the first gold coins, the dairic, and built roads that stretched across the continent. The most famous of these, the Royal Road, connected Sardis in Asia Minor to Susa near the Persian heartland, a distance of nearly 2,700 kilometers. Along its path, relay stations allowed messengers to travel from one end of the empire to the other in just a week. Herodotus would later marvel that neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness of night, could stop the couriers of the great king, a phrase that echoes still in the creed of modern postal services. But Darius's true genius lay in how he bound his vast empire together. He respected the diversity of his subjects, allowing them to worship their own gods, speak their own languages, and follow their own customs, so long as they remained loyal and paid tribute. In return, Persia offered protection, prosperity, and peace. Roads brought trade, trade brought wealth, and wealth brought stability. For over a century, this delicate balance made Persia the most advanced and humane empire the world had ever known. And yet, for all his pragmatism, Darius was still a man of vision and pride. To celebrate his power, he built a new capital, Persepolis, the city of the Persians. It rose from the plain like a vision from a dream, terraces carved into stone, colossal stairways flanked by reliefs of nobles, warriors, and emissaries from every corner of the empire bringing gifts to the king. The great palace halls were supported by columns as tall as trees, their capitals shaped like bulls and griffins. Here, art and politics merged, every carving, every detail spoke of unity and order. When foreign envoys walked through its gates, they saw not merely a king's house but the embodiment of an entire world in harmony. Under Darius, Persia reached its zenith, but ambition is a double-edged sword. In time, his gaze turned westward, toward Greece, where small, defiant city-states resisted his influence. The conflict that followed, the Greco-Persian Wars, would define the boundary between East and West for centuries to come. Darius sent armies across the Aegean, seeking to punish Athens and Eretria for their support of Ionian rebels. Yet at Marathon, in 490 BCE, the Persians suffered an unexpected defeat at the hands of the vastly outnumbered Athenians. For the first time, the empire had met resistance it could not simply crush. Darius's death passed the burden of revenge to his son, Xerxes I. Grand in vision and ruthless in execution, Xerxes assembled one of the largest armies ever seen, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, fleets of ships, and engineers who built bridges of boats to cross the Hellespont. His invasion of Greece was meant not just to conquer, but to remind the world of Persia's supremacy. At first, it seemed unstoppable. Cities fell, Athens burned, and the Persian tide surged westward. But in the narrow straits of Salamis, the Greek navy struck back, defeating the Persians in a battle that turned the course of history. The failure in Greece marked the beginning of Persia's slow decline. Though still powerful, the empire had stretched to its limits. Its rulers grew more isolated in their palaces, more distant from the people who once believed in them. In time, internal strife, corruption, and complacency eroded the unity that Cyrus and Darius had built. Yet for centuries more, Persia remained a beacon of stability, its system of governance, art, and tolerance admired even by its enemies. The story of Persia is not merely one of conquest, but of civilization's evolution. It was the first true world empire, not bound by race, religion, or language, but by an idea, that many peoples could live under one order, each retaining their identity while serving a greater whole. It was an empire of roads and gardens, of gold and stone, of wisdom and vision. And above all, it was an empire that believed in continuity, that empires rise and fall, but culture endures. Even in its fall to Alexander the Great 2 centuries later, Persia's spirit did not die. The conqueror himself adopted Persian dress, Persian customs, and Persian advisors. He understood what many before him had not, that Persia's true power was not in its armies, but in its ability to absorb and transform. Its influence would shape Greece, Rome, Byzantium, and the Islamic world that followed. The echoes of its governance, art, and philosophy still ripple through the fabric of civilization today. As the sun sets on the Persian plains, its legacy remains, not in ruins or monuments, but in the idea that strength can coexist with mercy, that greatness can emerge from unity, and that the rise of an empire need not mean the fall of humanity. The Persians taught the world that the truest conquest is not of land or people, but of time itself. Part 7, The Greeks, Fire of the West. The story of civilization is a pendulum, swinging endlessly between order and chaos, empire and rebellion, conquest and the yearning to be free. When Persia stretched its dominion across the known world, it seemed that no force could stand against it. From the deserts of Egypt to the valleys of the Indus, all bowed to the great king. Yet, on the western edge of this empire, beyond the shimmering Aegean Sea, lay a collection of small, fragmented city-states, too divided to be an empire, too proud to be conquered. Their lands were rocky, their soil thin, and their cities small. But in these humble places, something extraordinary was about to ignite. From the dust and stone of Greece, a flame would rise, a flame that would challenge kings, empires, and even the gods themselves. They called their land Hellas. To us, it is Greece, a land of mountains and islands, of sunlit shores and restless hearts. Here, geography shaped destiny. The rugged terrain kept its people divided into independent polis, city-states, each with its own laws, gods, and ambitions. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, names that still echo through the corridors of history. To be Greek was not to belong to one nation, but to share a spirit, the belief that the world was to be understood, questioned, and shaped by human reason. Yet before the philosophers and the poets, there were warriors. The story of Greece begins with struggle, a story older than democracy, older than empire. It begins with the Greeks' defiance of Persia. When Darius of Persia sent his armies across the Aegean in 490 BCE, he expected an easy victory. After all, what were a few quarrelsome city-states against the might of the world's greatest empire? But at a plain near the city of Marathon, 10,000 Athenian soldiers stood ready to prove that freedom was worth dying for. They were farmers, craftsmen, and citizens, men who had voted to defend their land rather than submit. Against all odds, they charged the Persian line, their bronze shields flashing in the sun, their battle cry shaking the air. When the dust settled, the Persians had fallen, and the Athenians had triumphed. The victory at Marathon did more than save a city, it gave birth to an idea. It proved that destiny was not reserved for kings or empires, but could belong to free men united by purpose. That day, the Greeks discovered something that would define their civilization, the power of the citizen. But Persia would not forget. A decade later, Darius's son, Xerxes I, returned with a vengeance. His army was vast, some say 1,000,000 strong, though the truth was likely less. Still, it was the largest force the ancient world had ever seen. Bridges of boats spanned the Hellespont, and the sea itself seemed to groan beneath the weight of his ambition. As Xerxes advanced, city after city fell. Yet Greece did not yield. At a narrow mountain pass called Thermopylae, a small band of warriors made their stand. Led by King Leonidas of Sparta, just 300 Spartans and a few thousand allies held the line against the Persian tide. For 3 days, they fought with unyielding resolve, their discipline and courage defying imagination. When betrayal revealed a secret path and doom became certain, Leonidas and his men did not flee. They fought to the last, their sacrifice buying precious time for Greece to rally. Their deaths were not in vain, they became a symbol, a legend, a testament to the belief that freedom was worth any price. Soon after, the Greeks met the Persians again, this time at sea. In the narrow straits of Salamis, where massive Persian ships struggled to maneuver, the smaller, faster Greek triremes struck with deadly precision. The sea became a graveyard of wrecked hulls and broken dreams. Xerxes watched from a golden throne on the shore as his fleet burned. The impossible had happened once again, Greece had defied the greatest empire on earth. These victories were more than battles, they were turning points in human history. They preserved the fragile experiment of Greek freedom, and with it, the chance for ideas to flourish that would shape the world forever. With the Persian threat repelled, Athens rose to glory. Under the leadership of Pericles, the city entered what would later be called its Golden Age, a time when art, philosophy, and democracy reached heights unseen before. The Acropolis rose like a crown above the city, its temples gleaming in the sunlight. The Parthenon, dedicated to Athena, stood as a symbol of human achievement, precise, balanced, and eternal. But Athens's greatest monument was not made of marble. It was an idea. For the first time, ordinary citizens governed themselves. They debated in the ecclesia, voted on laws, and held their leaders accountable. The city was alive with voices, of orators, thinkers, and dreamers who believed that reason, not birthright, should guide the destiny of men. In the marketplace, philosophers gathered to question everything, from the nature of the cosmos to the meaning of virtue. Socrates wandered barefoot through the streets, asking questions that unsettled the powerful and inspired the young. The unexamined life, he said, is not worth living. His disciple Plato would later build upon his teachings, founding the academy and imagining a world ruled by philosopher kings, where justice and wisdom shaped society. And Plato's student, Aristotle, would take that vision further still, laying the groundwork for science, logic, and ethics that endure to this day. Yet even in this golden age, the seeds of destruction were sown. Power, as it always does, breeds envy. Athens's growing influence through the Delian League, a coalition meant to protect Greece, began to look less like leadership and more like domination. Its allies became subjects, its tribute became taxes, and its ideals began to blur under the weight of empire. Across the Peloponnesus, another power watched with disdain, Sparta, the warrior state. Sparta was everything Athens was not. Where Athens celebrated art and debate, Sparta worshipped discipline and obedience. Its society was built for war, its people trained from childhood to fight, to endure, and to die for their city. To the Spartans, freedom meant strength, to the Athenians, it meant choice. Their values were irreconcilable, and their rivalry inevitable. The Peloponnesian War that followed would consume Greece for nearly 30 years. City turned against city, brother against brother. Athens's navy clashed with Sparta's armies in a struggle that left the land scarred and its people weary. Plague ravaged Athens, claiming Pericles himself, and hope slowly faded into exhaustion. In the end, Sparta triumphed, but victory came at a cost so great that even the victors were left broken. The dream of a united Greece, free and strong, was shattered. When the war ended, the cities that had once stood as beacons of reason and art lay weakened, ripe for conquest. Into this fractured world stepped a new power from the north, Macedon, under the rule of King Philip II and his brilliant son, Alexander. Alexander had been tutored by Aristotle himself. From his youth, he was taught that the world was vast and that greatness lay in uniting it. When he inherited his father's throne, he inherited not just a kingdom but a vision. In 334 BCE, he crossed the Hellespont, the same waters once bridged by Xerxes, not to destroy Persia, but to surpass it. What followed was one of the most extraordinary campaigns in history. In just over a decade, Alexander's armies swept across Asia Minor, through Egypt, Mesopotamia, Persia, and into India. At Gaugamela, he faced the Persian king Darius III, the last of the Achaemenids, and shattered his forces. The Persian Empire, once the master of the world, fell before the fire of Greek ambition. But Alexander was more than a conqueror. He sought to fuse East and West, to blend Greek and Persian cultures into a single civilization. He married a Persian princess, adopted local customs, and encouraged his men to do the same. In his new cities, all named Alexandria, Greek architecture stood beside Eastern temples, and philosophers debated with mystics. It was as if the torch of civilization had passed from one hand to another, merging into a brighter flame. Yet the fire that burns brightest burns fastest. Alexander died young, at just 32, in the palace of Babylon, the same city once ruled by Cyrus. His empire, too vast and too new, collapsed within years. His generals divided it into fragments, each claiming a piece of his legacy. But his vision did not die. Through the Hellenistic world, Greek art, science, and philosophy spread from Egypt to India, shaping cultures for centuries to come. The Greeks had conquered not with walls or armies, but with ideas, ideas that would outlive kingdoms and empires. They had given humanity the concept of democracy, the pursuit of truth, and the belief that reason could unlock the secrets of the universe. In their theaters, they explored tragedy and comedy, the light and shadow of the human soul. In their temples, they carved marble into perfection. In their schools, they taught that knowledge was the truest form of power. And yet, beneath their brilliance, the Greeks were still human, flawed, passionate, and fragile. Their world, for all its wisdom, could not escape the cycles of rise and fall. In time, a new power would emerge from the West, stronger, more disciplined, and destined to inherit both their glory and their mistakes. But before Rome could rise, Greece had to fade. The fire of the West had burned with blinding intensity, and though the flame would dim, its light would never truly go out. For every idea born in Athens, every question asked by Socrates, every triumph carved into marble, still shapes the way we see ourselves. The Greeks taught us not what to believe, but how to think. And in that, their conquest was not of land, but of the human mind. As the Mediterranean darkens beneath the stars, the voices of Greece still whisper through time, voices of courage, wisdom, and wonder. The fire they kindled still burns in every age that dares to ask, what does it mean to be human? Part 8, The Iron Republic. History is a wheel. It turns slowly, crushing empires beneath its weight, raising others from their ashes. When the brilliance of Greece began to fade into memory, the world looked westward, toward a land of hills and rivers, where a new kind of power was taking shape. It was not born of poetry or philosophy, but of endurance. It was forged not in marble but in iron. And its name was Rome. The story of Rome begins not in grandeur, but in myth. They said that the city was founded by Romulus, who, along with his twin brother Remus, was abandoned as an infant and suckled by a she-wolf in the wilderness. Whether that tale was truth or legend hardly mattered, for Rome itself would always walk the thin line between myth and reality, between savagery and civilization. From its very beginning, Rome was a survivor. Perched along the banks of the Tiber River, Rome was born from mud and determination. The early Romans were farmers, shepherds, and warriors, rough people living in a rough land. Around them lay older, richer civilizations, the Etruscans to the north, the Greeks to the south. Rome borrowed from both, their gods, their alphabets, their architecture, but transformed these influences into something entirely its own. Even in its youth, Rome had a peculiar gift, the ability to take what others had created and make it stronger, sharper, and more enduring. In 509 BCE, the Romans did something remarkable. They overthrew their kings. They would no longer be ruled by a single man but by the people themselves, or at least, by those who claimed to represent them. Thus was born the Roman Republic, a system of government unlike any the world had seen. Power was shared among elected officials, consuls, senators, and tribunes, who served not for life, but for a term. Laws were debated, written, and enforced through a balance of ambition and restraint. It was imperfect, fragile, and often corrupt, but it worked. The Republic was more than a government. It was a mindset. Every Roman, from the lowliest farmer to the proudest senator, believed in the idea of virtus, strength, discipline, and duty to the state. They called their homeland the residential publica, the public thing, because it belonged to no single ruler, but to Rome itself. In this idea lay the seed of something vast and enduring. Rome expanded not by accident, but by design. Its armies were not merely soldiers, they were builders, engineers, and colonists. Everywhere they went, they left behind the mark of Rome, roads, bridges, aqueducts, and law. To be conquered by Rome was not just to lose one's freedom, it was to be absorbed into something greater. The conquered became Romans, and the empire grew not only in size but in identity. The heart of this machine was the Roman legion, the most disciplined and effective fighting force the world had ever seen. Each soldier was a cog in a larger design, trained to move, fight, and die as one. Their shields locked in perfect formation, their discipline unbreakable. Against them, even mighty kingdoms fell. But what truly set Rome apart was not the sword, but the law. For every fortress they built, they also built systems of governance, courts, and contracts. Where others conquered for plunder, Rome conquered for permanence. Yet, the Republic's greatest strength was also its weakness. Its citizens were driven by ambition, by the hunger for glory and power. In time, that ambition would turn inward. The first cracks began to show in the late Republic, when generals like Marius and Sulla began to command armies loyal not to Rome, but to themselves. Civil war became the price of power. Then came Julius Caesar, soldier, statesman, visionary. He conquered Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, and declared himself the protector of Rome. To his enemies, he was a tyrant, to his followers, a savior. He dreamed of reforming the Republic, of giving land to the poor, of creating a Rome strong enough to endure forever. But Rome was not ready for a single man's rule. In 44 BCE, as he entered the Senate, Caesar was surrounded by men he called friends. With knives flashing in the torchlight, they struck him down, 23 times, beneath the statue of Pompey. The Republic had killed its greatest son. But in doing so, it had also killed itself. The age of the Republic ended that day, and from its blood rose an empire. In the chaos that followed, Caesar's adopted son, Octavian, emerged victorious. He took the title Augustus, meaning the revered one. With quiet calculation, he gathered the fragments of the Republic and reshaped them into the Roman Empire. The Senate still met, the elections still happened, but everyone knew where power truly lay. Augustus ruled with absolute authority, cloaked in the language of tradition. He did not destroy the Republic, he embalmed it, preserving its form while draining it of life. Under Augustus, Rome entered its golden age. The civil wars ceased, trade flourished, and the empire stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the deserts of Arabia. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, lasted for 2 centuries. Roads bound the empire together like veins carrying the lifeblood of civilization. Cities rose with amphitheaters, baths, temples, and forums. Latin became the language of law, order, and power. At its height, Rome was not merely a city, it was the world. To be Roman was to live under the protection of law, to enjoy the fruits of prosperity, to feel a sense of destiny that seemed eternal. The Colosseum rose like a monument to both glory and cruelty, a place where slaves, criminals, and gladiators fought to the death for the entertainment of citizens. It was a brutal reminder that even the greatest civilizations are built on the suffering of others. Behind the grandeur, shadows deepened. The emperors who followed Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Nero, each revealed a darker side of absolute power. Paranoia, decadence, and madness began to creep through the marble halls of the Palatine Hill. While armies secured the frontiers, corruption festered within. Yet, through every storm, Rome endured. It was said that Rome's strength lay in her ability to adapt. When she faced new gods, she adopted them. When she met new peoples, she absorbed them. When she encountered new ideas, she reshaped them in her image. Rome's genius was not invention, but endurance. But endurance has limits, and even the greatest walls eventually crumble. By the 2nd century CE, under emperors like Trajan and Hadrian, the empire reached its zenith. Its borders stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia. Its cities glittered with wealth. And yet, in the quiet corners of its vast domain, cracks had already begun to form. The cost of empire, the endless wars, the heavy taxes, the strain on its people, began to weigh on the state. The Roman ideal of citizenship faded as wealth and privilege concentrated in the hands of the few. Still, Rome refused to die quietly. When the world changed, Rome changed with it. In time, a new faith began to spread through its cities, the teachings of a man named Jesus of Nazareth, who preached love, humility, and forgiveness. His followers, once persecuted as criminals, would one day reshape the very empire that sought to destroy them. Rome was no longer just a power of swords and legions. It had become something more, an idea, a symbol, a force of civilization itself. Its legacy stretched far beyond its borders, into the very fabric of the Western world. Law, language, architecture, government, all carried the mark of Rome. And yet, beneath the marble and the glory, the same question lingered that had haunted every civilization before it: how long could it last? The world had seen this pattern before: rise, glory, decline. The gods, it seemed, always demanded balance. As night falls over the eternal city, the streets grow silent. The Tiber glistens in the moonlight, flowing as it has for thousands of years. Somewhere, a soldier stands watch at the walls, gazing into the darkness beyond, wondering what lies ahead. He cannot know that centuries later, barbarians will come, that the empire he defends will crumble, and that Rome itself will become a memory. But he also cannot know that the idea of Rome, the belief in law, in order, in the endurance of civilization, will never die. It will pass into the veins of nations yet unborn, shaping kings and republics alike. For though empires fall, the dream of Rome endures, unbroken, eternal, whispering through time like a heartbeat beneath the stones. Part 9: The Fall of Rome and the Shadow of the Dark Ages. There are moments in history when the light fades so slowly that no one notices until it's gone. When the grandeur of empire becomes a ghost, and the certainty of civilization dissolves into mist. The fall of Rome was not an explosion, it was an erosion. A slow, steady crumbling of what once seemed eternal. And as the marble cracked, as the legions vanished, and the roads grew silent, the world entered an age of shadow, a time when the old gods fell silent and a new world struggled to be born. For centuries, Rome had been the beating heart of the Western world, its cities alive with trade and art, its armies guarding frontiers that stretched from the misty forests of Britain to the burning sands of Egypt. To live under Rome was to live within a world that felt ordered and unshakable. But even as emperors celebrated their triumphs, something beneath the surface had begun to shift. The weight of empire was too great, the burden of its vastness too heavy. By the 3rd century CE, Rome was no longer a city of strength but a state of exhaustion. Plagues swept through its provinces. Armies fought not only enemies at the borders, but each other, as generals and usurpers battled for the throne. In a single 50-year span, more than 20 emperors rose and fell, each leaving the empire weaker than before. Meanwhile, at its edges, the world was changing. Beyond the northern frontier, tribes the Romans called barbarians, Goths, Vandals, Franks, Saxons, watched the empire with growing hunger. They had fought Rome for centuries, sometimes as enemies, sometimes as allies. They admired its roads, its weapons, its wealth. But they had also learned its weaknesses. The Emperor Diocletian tried to save Rome through division. He split the empire in two, an eastern half ruled from Byzantium, and a western half ruled from Rome. It was a desperate attempt to manage what had grown unmanageable. For a time, it worked. The East, rich and urbanized, endured. But the West, stretched thin and drained of resources, began to decay. Then came Constantine, a man who saw that the world was changing in ways no sword could control. He moved the capital east, to a city on the Bosporus, Constantinople, and in doing so, gave life to what would one day be called the Byzantine Empire. But Constantine's greatest legacy was not political, it was spiritual. In the year 313, he issued the Edict of Milan, granting freedom to a once persecuted faith, Christianity. For centuries, the followers of Christ had lived in hiding, worshipping in secret catacombs beneath the cities of the empire. They had been crucified, burned, and fed to lions. But now, suddenly, their faith was the faith of emperors. Pagan temples fell silent. The old gods, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, faded from memory. Crosses replaced statues, and the world began to see itself through new eyes. The empire that had once ruled by force now sought salvation through faith. But no conversion could save the West. The empire was collapsing from within. Its economy crumbled. Its farms were abandoned. Its people, once proud citizens, now lived in fear, paying taxes to both Rome and to the invaders who ravaged its borders. The legions, once the symbol of order, were now filled with foreign mercenaries who fought for gold rather than loyalty. And then, in the year 410 CE, something happened that no Roman could have imagined. The city of Rome, the eternal city, was sacked. The Visigoths, led by their king Alaric, stormed through its gates. For 3 days, they looted the city that had once ruled the world. Fire spread through temples and forums. Statues of emperors were toppled, their marble faces shattered beneath the feet of men who spoke strange tongues. It was not just a defeat. It was the end of an illusion, the moment when Rome realized it was mortal. The world gasped. The poet Saint Jerome wrote, "If Rome can perish, what can be safe?" To the people of the time, it felt as though the universe itself was collapsing. But Rome did not die in a single night. It lingered, hollowed out, for decades more, until, in the year 476, the final emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a barbarian general named Odoacer. The boy emperor was sent away quietly. No armies marched. No great battle was fought. The Roman Empire simply ceased to exist. What came after was not chaos, not immediately. But it was silence. The cities that had once hummed with commerce grew still. Roads crumbled. Trade vanished. The knowledge that had filled libraries was scattered or lost. The light of Rome flickered out, and with it, the idea of civilization itself seemed to fade. The Western world entered a new age, an age that posterity would call dark. And yet, even in darkness, embers remained. In the ruins of empire, new powers began to stir. The Church, once a persecuted faith, now became the guardian of memory. Monks in remote monasteries copied the few surviving manuscripts of ancient writers, preserving the thoughts of Plato, Aristotle, and Cicero. They tilled the land, prayed through the night, and kept the fragile flame of knowledge alive. In the forests of Gaul, in the hills of Britain, in the valleys of Italy, small kingdoms rose where once there had been provinces. The Franks, the Anglo-Saxons, the Lombards, each carved out their own realms from the corpse of Rome. Their kings wore crowns, but they lacked the grandeur of emperors. Their palaces were wooden halls, their law spoken rather than written. Yet these were the seeds from which new nations would grow. Meanwhile, in the east, the other half of the empire endured. Constantinople stood like a beacon, its walls unbroken, its palaces glittering with mosaics and gold. There, emperors still called themselves Romans. There, art, science, and law continued to flourish. The Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire, preserved the legacy of Rome for another 1,000 years. But in the West, the torch had fallen. To many, it seemed that the gods themselves had turned away. The roads became overgrown. The aqueducts dried. The voice of reason was replaced by superstition, and the world grew smaller, more fearful. The memory of the old world lingered like a dream, the vision of marble cities and written laws, of scholars and senators, but it was a dream fading in the mists of time. And yet, the human spirit endures. Even in the darkest centuries, people adapted, survived, and rebuilt. Farmers turned ruined villas into villages. Blacksmiths forged tools from broken swords. And from the rubble of empire, new cultures began to emerge, rough, unpolished, but alive. The fall of Rome was not the end of civilization. It was its transformation. The world had grown too large, too complex, too divided to be ruled by one city. The fall was not destruction, it was division. A scattering of seeds across the soil of Europe. In time, those seeds would grow into something new, kingdoms, nations, and eventually, the idea of Europe itself. But for centuries after the fall, the people who lived among the ruins could only look at the broken stones and wonder who had built them. They called the old ways the time of giants. They knew only fragments of what had once been, a name carved in Latin, a coin stamped with a forgotten emperor's face, a road that led nowhere. The memory of Rome had become legend. In the flicker of monastery candles, monks whispered prayers over parchment. Outside, wolves howled in the distance. The world was dark, but not empty. For though the empire was gone, its shadow stretched long into the centuries that followed. In its wake came kings and crusaders, scholars and saints. The world would rebuild, slowly, painfully, guided by the faint echoes of a civilization that refused to be forgotten. When historians later looked back on this time, they would call it the Dark Ages. But perhaps that name is unfair. For in truth, even in the deepest night, the stars still shine. And those stars, faith, memory, knowledge, would one day guide humanity out of darkness and into dawn. The story of Rome's fall is not the story of an ending, but of endurance. The empire may have died, but its idea, of law, of order, of civilization, survived, waiting for the world to be ready again. And so, as the old world sank into shadow, the first faint lights of a new age began to appear, small, fragile, and flickering, but real. A new Europe was forming, not from conquest, but from survival. And from these ashes, a new kind of world would one day rise. Part 10, The Age of Faith, Rise of the Church and the Medieval World. When the empire fell, it did not leave silence behind, it left an echo. That echo became a prayer. For centuries, Rome had ruled the body of the world, its roads, its armies, its trade. But when those crumbled, something else took its place, a power that ruled the soul. In the ruins of marble cities, as the legions disappeared into memory, men and women began to turn their eyes upward. They no longer looked to emperors for order or to philosophers for reason. They looked to God. The church had been born in the shadows, whispered in catacombs beneath the Roman streets, carried in secret symbols of fish and cross. But now, in a world stripped bare of empire, it became the only institution that endured. While kings came and went, bishops stayed. While kingdoms burned, monasteries rebuilt. While knowledge was lost, monks preserved it, letter by letter, prayer by prayer. This was the beginning of what we now call the Middle Ages, but to those who lived it, it was simply life, uncertain, sacred, fragile. In these centuries, faith became the framework of the world. The church filled the void that empire had left. It offered not roads or armies, but hope. It gave people something to believe in when everything else had fallen. The landscape of Europe changed. The grand arenas and temples of Rome stood as broken shells, but in their place rose churches, tall, solemn, and eternal. Bells replaced the roar of crowds. Where once the forum echoed with the voice of emperors, now the chants of monks floated through the morning fog. The idea of the monastery, a community devoted to prayer, silence, and work, spread like seeds across the continent. In remote valleys and forest clearings, men and women withdrew from the world, devoting their lives to God. They built stone walls, planted gardens, copied manuscripts. Inside those candlelit halls, they preserved the fragments of the ancient world, the words of Plato, Aristotle, Virgil, writing them again and again in beautiful, illuminated letters. To the outside world, they seemed cut off, cloistered, even mad. But in truth, they were the memory keepers of humanity. The light they guarded would one day reignite the world. But beyond the monastery walls, Europe was raw and restless. The collapse of Rome had left the continent fractured. Powerful warlords carved out territories. Tribes became kingdoms, the Franks in Gaul, the Angles and Saxons in Britain, the Visigoths in Spain, the Lombards in Italy. Each spoke its own language, followed its own customs. There was no single law, no single ruler. Only the Church, with its Latin prayers and sacred texts, offered a common thread that bound them together. And slowly, that thread grew stronger. The story of this new world cannot be told without one name, Charlemagne. Born in the 8th century, he was the son of a Frankish king, but he dreamed not of petty warlords and raided villages, he dreamed of empire. Through decades of conquest, he united much of Western Europe under his rule. But unlike the emperors of old, Charlemagne sought not only to conquer land, but to conquer ignorance. He built schools, reformed the clergy, and invited scholars from across Europe to his court. In the year 800, on Christmas Day, he entered the ancient city of Rome. There, in the great Basilica of St. Peter's, Pope Leo III placed a crown upon his head and declared him Emperor of the Romans. It was a symbolic act, the Roman Empire reborn in Christian form. But this new empire would not be ruled by marble and legions. It would be ruled by parchment and prayer. Charlemagne's realm, the Holy Roman Empire, was an attempt to fuse the spiritual authority of the Church with the political order of kingship. It was a vision of a world where power served faith, and faith sanctified power. For a moment, it seemed that unity had returned. But when Charlemagne died, his empire fractured, divided among his heirs, and the dream of a united Christendom began to splinter once more. Yet even as kingdoms rose and fell, the influence of the Church only deepened. The papacy, once a small office in Rome, now became a throne of immense power. Popes began to challenge kings, claiming that their authority came directly from God. The Church was no longer merely a refuge, it was a kingdom of its own, invisible yet absolute. The medieval world was a world of contrasts. On one hand, life was brutal. Famine, war, and plague haunted the land. Villages burned, and borders shifted endlessly. But on the other hand, faith gave people meaning, a structure to endure suffering. Every birth, every marriage, every death was bound to ritual. The rhythm of the year was marked not by politics or trade, but by feast days and holy seasons. At the center of every town stood a church, its spire pointing to heaven. Within, flickering candles cast light upon stained glass that told the stories of saints and miracles. Most people could not read, but they could see. The art of the church was its language, a language of awe, of mystery, of salvation. And as centuries passed, this language grew into architecture. The great cathedrals of Europe began to rise, vast, impossible structures of stone and light. They took generations to build. Fathers laid the foundations that their grandsons would never live to see finished. Yet still they built, driven by faith and the hope of eternal reward. When you stand beneath those vaulted ceilings today, in Chartres, in Notre Dame, in Cologne, you are standing inside the dreams of men who believed they were touching heaven. But the age of faith was not only about devotion, it was also about control. The same church that comforted peasants could also command kings. It dictated what could be believed, what could be said, what could even be imagined. Heresy, the act of thinking differently, became a crime. Entire movements were crushed, books burned, lives ended in the name of purity. And yet, despite the rigidity, something new was stirring beneath the surface. In the monasteries, the scholars began to ask questions. Could reason the wisdom of the ancients, long condemned as pagan, serve to explain the mysteries of God? Slowly, quietly, the seeds of intellectual rebirth were being planted. The world of the Middle Ages was not merely dark or devout, it was alive with contradiction. Faith and fear walked side by side. Knowledge and superstition coexisted in uneasy harmony. Knights carried swords blessed by priests. Doctors treated illness with both herbs and prayer. The Church guided, but it also guarded, preserving the wisdom of the past while restraining the curiosity of the present. As the centuries unfolded, the Church's reach extended far beyond Europe. It sent missionaries into the frozen north, to convert the Norse. It preached to the wild tribes of the East. It sanctified crusades, holy wars that promised salvation through battle. Men marched under the sign of the cross, believing they were fighting for God. But faith, once the quiet refuge of the oppressed, had become the weapon of empires. The same prayers whispered in candlelight were now sung on the march to Jerusalem. The holy became political. The spiritual became worldly. And yet, through all of it, the cathedrals, the crusades, the coronations, there remained something pure in the hearts of ordinary people. The peasant woman lighting a candle for her sick child. The monk copying a single line of scripture by hand, hour after hour. The pilgrim walking barefoot across mountains, seeking forgiveness. These small acts of devotion, repeated across generations, gave the Middle Ages its soul. The age of faith was not an age of peace, but it was an age of endurance. It taught humanity how to rebuild meaning after collapse. It kept the flame alive long enough for the world to find its way again. By the time the first millennium drew to a close, Europe was stirring once more. The population was growing. Trade was returning. Towns were being rebuilt. Beneath the cross, civilization was slowly waking from its long sleep. And soon, curiosity, that old Roman fire, would return. It would begin in the quiet study of monks, in the rediscovery of Aristotle, in the questions of a few brave minds who dared to look beyond dogma. The Church that had saved the world from chaos would one day face a new challenge, a rebirth of reason. But that belongs to another story, the story of rediscovery, rebellion, and renewal. The dawn after the long night. Part 11, The Awakening, the Renaissance and the rebirth of knowledge. Every age believes itself to be the dawn after a darkness. But for the people who lived through the 15th and 16th centuries, it truly was. The Middle Ages, long, devout, and disciplined, had kept civilization alive through faith and endurance. Yet by the dawn of the Renaissance, that same faith had begun to transform into curiosity. The old world was not being destroyed. It was being rediscovered. It began not with kings or battles, but with books, dusty manuscripts, copied by patient hands in the cloisters of monasteries. Scholars began to open these ancient pages and found, buried in their ink, a forgotten voice, the voice of the ancients. The words of Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, and Euclid spoke again, like echoes from a lost civilization. Their ideas were bold, rational, and human. They spoke not only of God but of man, his reason, his beauty, his power to shape his own world. To those who read them, it was like the world itself had been reborn. The word Renaissance means rebirth. It was not just a rebirth of art or science, it was a rebirth of confidence. For centuries, people had seen themselves as sinners in a fallen world, living in the shadow of eternity. But now, slowly, a new idea emerged, that humanity itself was divine in its capacity to create. This transformation began in Italy, where the ruins of Rome still whispered beneath the soil. In cities like Florence, Venice, and Rome, wealth and art walked hand in hand. Merchant families like the Medici grew rich from trade and banking, and with their wealth came a hunger for beauty, not merely for devotion, but for expression. They became patrons of artists, architects, and thinkers who would shape the world. In Florence, under the golden light of the Tuscan sun, young sculptor named Michelangelo Buonarroti carved life out of marble. His David, calm, poised, perfect, was more than a statue. It was a declaration that man, not just God, could embody perfection. Nearby, Leonardo da Vinci filled his notebooks with sketches of flight, anatomy, and invention. To him, art and science were one, both attempts to understand the truth of creation. He painted not only faces but the spirit within them. And above them all, in Rome, Raphael painted frescoes that captured the harmony between faith and reason, saints standing beside philosophers, the divine and the human united in a single vision. The Renaissance was not a rejection of God. It was a rediscovery of his reflection, not in heaven, but in humanity. The Church still stood at the center of life, but now it shared that space with the artist, the scientist, and the thinker. Cathedrals gave way to galleries. The ink of theology mingled with the ink of invention. The city of Florence became the symbol of this awakening. Under the guidance of Lorenzo de' Medici, called Lorenzo the Magnificent, art, philosophy, and politics intertwined. His court became a gathering place for geniuses, poets like Dante and Petrarch, who wrote in the language of the people rather than in Latin, artists like Botticelli, whose Birth of Venus dared to bring pagan beauty into a Christian world. This was a time of tension, between devotion and discovery, humility and pride, salvation and self. The people of the Renaissance walked a delicate line between the sacred and the human. They still believed in God, but they began to believe in themselves too. Meanwhile, across Europe, another revolution was quietly unfolding, one that would spread knowledge farther than any empire could. In the year 1440, Johannes Gutenberg, a German craftsman, invented the printing press. What had once taken months to copy by hand could now be printed in hours. Books, once treasures of kings and monasteries, became tools for everyone. This single invention changed everything. Ideas spread like wildfire. A book could travel farther than a preacher, last longer than a king, and reach more hearts than any sermon. For the first time, the words of one mind could awaken thousands. And with knowledge came questioning. In the year 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of a church in Wittenberg. He was not trying to destroy the church, but to purify it, to call it back to humility, to truth. But his challenge sparked something much larger, the Reformation. Across Europe, old loyalties began to fracture. The unity of Christendom, which had endured for 1,000 years, began to split. Protestants and Catholics argued not just over theology, but over the soul of the world. Wars were fought. Nations were born. And yet, even through conflict, something greater was stirring, the birth of individuality. For the first time, a person could read the Bible in their own language, interpret it with their own mind, and live by their own conscience. It was the beginning of freedom, and the beginning of modernity. But the Renaissance was not only a European story. It was global. The same age that produced the Mona Lisa and the Sistine Chapel also saw sails on the horizon, ships bound for unknown worlds. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, sailing under the flag of Spain, reached the shores of the Americas. It was a moment that shattered geography itself. The known world doubled overnight. Old maps were rewritten. Civilizations that had thrived for centuries in isolation, the Aztecs, the Mayans, the Inca, suddenly found themselves drawn into a new, brutal web of conquest and discovery. Europe's awakening came at a cost. As art and science flourished, so too did empire and exploitation. The same minds that painted angels also charted oceans, seeking gold and glory. The Renaissance revealed both sides of humanity, its genius and its greed. And yet, in every shadow, there was still light. The scientists of this age began to look not to the heavens for answers, but to nature itself. Men like Copernicus dared to say that the Earth was not the center of the universe, but merely one planet among many. Galileo, with his telescope, confirmed it, and for his courage, he was condemned. But he whispered words that would echo for centuries, and yet it moves. This was the beginning of the scientific revolution, the moment when faith and reason began to part ways. It did not happen all at once. It was slow, painful, and filled with doubt. But the seed was planted. Humanity had begun to trust its own eyes, its own instruments, its own mind. The Renaissance taught humanity that the world was vast, that beauty could be human, that knowledge could be its own act of worship. It did not destroy faith, it transformed it. Where the Middle Ages had prayed for salvation, the Renaissance searched for understanding. And so, the world began to breathe again. In the glow of candlelight, in the hum of workshops and the echo of university halls, something was stirring, a new rhythm, a pulse of invention. Painters studied anatomy, astronomers mapped the heavens, mathematicians discovered the invisible laws of motion. The boundaries between sacred and secular blurred, until creation itself became the language of devotion. From Florence to Rome, from Paris to London, the spirit of curiosity spread like morning light across a darkened field. The Renaissance was not just a period, it was a turning of the human gaze, from heaven to earth, from eternity to the present. It reminded humanity that to seek truth was not rebellion, it was reverence. By the time the 16th century gave way to the 17th, the world was transformed. The printing press had given birth to a new kind of power, the power of ideas. Artists, scientists, and philosophers began to see themselves not as servants of kings or popes, but as explorers of truth. And in that moment, fragile, uncertain, and brilliant, humanity rediscovered itself. The Renaissance was not a conquest of empires or armies. It was a quiet revolution of the mind, a conquest of ignorance, a reclaiming of wonder. The same way dawn creeps across the horizon, unnoticed until it fills the sky, so too did this rebirth unfold, slowly, inevitably, gloriously. What began as a whisper in the monasteries became a roar in the universities. What began with faith became knowledge. And what began with ruins became civilization once more. The world was awake again. But every dawn casts new shadows. As the Renaissance gave birth to enlightenment, exploration, and reason, it also awakened ambition, the hunger for power, wealth, and domination that would shape the centuries to come. And so, as Europe turned its eyes outward, toward oceans and continents, toward empires and revolutions, a new age began to rise, an age of discovery and empire. Part 13, The Age of Enlightenment, when reason challenged the world. There are times when the world changes not because of wars or conquests, but because of ideas. Not because of kings or empires, but because of questions, quiet, relentless questions that echo through the minds of people who refuse to stop asking why. The 18th century was one such time. It was not born in blood or revolution, at least not at first. It began in salons, in libraries, in the flicker of candlelight reflected in the eyes of thinkers who believed that reason, not faith, not tradition, should guide humanity. This was the age of enlightenment, when the human mind turned inward to understand the universe and itself. For thousands of years, people had looked upward for answers. The gods of the mountains, the heavens, and the scriptures had defined truth and morality. But now, for the first time, men and women began to look within. They began to ask whether truth might be discovered not through revelation, but through observation, logic, and experiment. In coffeehouses and printing shops, philosophers debated the nature of freedom, power, and justice. Books circulated faster than ever before. Pamphlets spread ideas that could not be contained by borders or kings. Europe was no longer just exploring the world, it was exploring the human mind. And at the center of this new age was a single conviction, that knowledge could liberate humanity. In England, John Locke wrote that all people were born not as subjects, but as free individuals, with natural rights to life, liberty, and property. In France, Voltaire fought for freedom of speech, mocking kings and priests alike with wit sharp enough to draw blood. Jean-Jacques Rousseau spoke of equality, warning that civilization itself might be the cause of humanity's corruption. And Montesquieu imagined a system of checks and balances that could limit the power of rulers, a vision that would inspire future democracies. It was an era of belief in the power of the mind, but also, ironically, an age of arrogance. Many thinkers saw reason as absolute, as though the universe itself could be reduced to logic. Yet within this overconfidence lay the seeds of progress. The Enlightenment reshaped everything, from science and politics to art and morality. Isaac Newton's laws of motion had already revealed that the universe was not a chaotic miracle, but a vast, ordered system. The same logic began to be applied to society. If gravity could be explained, could tyranny? If nature followed laws, could government? People began to imagine nations as machines, systems that could be built, improved, or repaired. The divine right of kings began to look like superstition. For centuries, monarchs ruled because they claimed to be chosen by God. But now, thinkers asked, what if power came not from heaven, but from the consent of the governed? It was a dangerous question, one that would soon set the world on fire. In Paris, intellectuals gathered in drawing rooms to discuss philosophy. Across the Channel, British pamphleteers criticized their own government. In the American colonies, men like Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Paine read the works of Locke and Montesquieu, and began to dream of a new nation founded not on kingship, but on liberty. The Enlightenment spread like wildfire, carried by printing presses and whispered in the streets. It crossed oceans, defied censorship, and awakened something ancient in the human heart, the desire to be free. But freedom was not an easy idea. To the rulers of Europe, it was a threat. Monarchs who had once considered themselves God's chosen began to realize that their people were questioning everything. The Enlightenment did not only challenge religion, it challenged power itself. Still, not all was rebellion. Many monarchs tried to adapt. Some became enlightened despots, rulers who adopted reason to strengthen their rule. Catherine the Great in Russia, Frederick the Great in Prussia, and Joseph II of Austria supported education, reformed laws, and funded science, but never gave up their thrones. Reason, it seemed, could serve both freedom and control. Meanwhile, in the laboratories and observatories of Europe, the scientific spirit grew ever bolder. Carl Linnaeus classified the natural world. Antoine Lavoisier identified oxygen and revolutionized chemistry. Denis Diderot compiled the Encyclopédie, a massive collection of human knowledge that aimed to make wisdom accessible to all. It was a heroic dream, that ignorance could be defeated not with swords, but with ideas. And yet, even as reason triumphed, the world remained unequal. The same thinkers who wrote about liberty often ignored the cries of those enslaved or colonized. Enlightenment Europe still profited from the slave trade and empire. For many, the light of reason illuminated only part of the world, leaving vast regions in shadow. Still, those shadows did not last forever. The words freedom, rights, and equality began to echo far beyond Europe's salons. They inspired revolutions that would reshape the earth. In 1776, in a small hall in Philadelphia, a group of men declared that all men are created equal, and that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed. The American Revolution had begun, and its cry of liberty was the direct child of Enlightenment thought. Just a few years later, in 1789, the French Revolution erupted. Hungry peasants, angry citizens, and ambitious thinkers rose against the monarchy. They toppled kings, stormed bastilles, and declared that liberty, equality, and fraternity would guide a new France. It was the Enlightenment's dream made real, and also, its nightmare. For in the chaos that followed, reason turned to terror. The guillotine became the symbol of equality. Streets that once hosted philosophers ran red with blood. In trying to create a perfect world through reason, France discovered the darkness that reason could not control, the rage and fear buried deep within the human soul. Still, even amidst violence, something irreversible had happened. The world had changed. The idea that people could rule themselves, that governments were human inventions, not divine decrees, could never be forgotten. By the dawn of the 19th century, monarchs still ruled, but their crowns trembled. The Enlightenment had planted a seed that would grow through revolutions, wars, and generations, the belief that knowledge and freedom are the birthright of every human being. It was also an age of contradictions. Empires expanded even as they spoke of liberty. Scientists catalogued the wonders of nature even as they exploited it. Philosophers dreamed of universal rights even as they ignored the rights of women, indigenous peoples, and the enslaved. But history, like light, moves unevenly, casting shadows even as it reveals. By the end of the 18th century, humanity stood at a crossroads. The mind had conquered superstition. Science had explained the stars. Politics had begun to imagine equality. But another revolution was about to begin, one not of thought, but of industry. The machines were coming. And with them, the next chapter in humanity's long, restless journey, one that would transform not only how people thought, but how they lived. The Enlightenment had taught humanity to question everything. The Industrial Revolution would teach it to build everything anew. Part 14, The Industrial Revolution, when machines awakened the modern world. There are moments in history when the rhythm of the world changes. When the sounds of nature, the wind, the river, the heartbeat of the earth, are joined by a new sound, the hiss of steam, the clang of iron, the turning of gears. For thousands of years, life had moved at the pace of muscle, wind, and water. The farmer's plow, the weaver's loom, the merchant's cart, all depended on hands, beasts, and weather. But then, almost suddenly, in the late 18th century, something stirred. A new energy began to pulse through the world, invisible, mechanical, unstoppable. It began not with kings or empires, but with invention. In the workshops and coal towns of Britain, ordinary men tinkered with extraordinary ideas. The land was changing. Fields gave way to factories, villages to cities. Beneath the soil, black stone, coal, burned hotter and longer than wood, feeding furnaces that would soon power the world. And at the heart of it all was the steam engine. When James Watt improved its design in the 1760s, he didn't just create a machine, he changed time itself. No longer was energy bound to muscle or season. Power could now be made anywhere, anytime. The breath of steam became the heartbeat of modernity. Factories rose like cathedrals of industry. Looms clattered day and night, spinning cotton into cloth at unimaginable speed. Textiles became the first great engine of the Industrial Revolution, weaving together global empires, raw cotton from India and the American South, manufactured goods from Manchester and Birmingham, and profits flowing through imperial veins. But progress, as always, came with a price. The factory was both miracle and prison. Inside, men, women, and children worked 12 to 16 hours a day. Their lungs filled with dust, their hands with blisters. The hum of machines drowned out the human voice. For the first time in history, people became part of the machinery they had created. And yet, there was no stopping it. Coal-powered engines. Engines powered factories. Factories powered cities. Cities powered nations. A chain of energy and ambition linked the entire world. In the early 1800s, Britain became the workshop of the world. Smoke rose over London, Manchester, and Liverpool, dark clouds that some called the breath of progress, and others the breath of death. Rivers turned black with waste, yet their banks swelled with wealth. The Industrial Revolution was not just a change in technology, it was a change in how humans saw themselves. For the first time, humanity felt capable of reshaping nature. Mountains were mined, forests cleared, rivers redirected. Time itself was measured differently, no longer by the sun, but by the factory bell. The ancient rhythm of sunrise and sunset gave way to the relentless tick of the clock. This new world needed new ideas. Philosophers and economists struggled to understand it. Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, describing the invisible hand of the market, how competition and self-interest could, in theory, create prosperity for all. But others saw the darker side. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, watching the poor toil in the factories of Manchester, declared that capitalism itself was a system built on exploitation, that history was now a struggle between those who owned the machines and those who served them. For the first time, class became destiny. The divide between rich and poor grew into a canyon. The old nobility of birth was replaced by a new aristocracy, the owners of capital, the masters of production. And yet, amidst this struggle, innovation flourished. The steam engine was joined by the railway. Iron tracks stretched across countries, turning weeks of travel into days. The locomotive, that iron horse of the 19th century, connected ports, cities, and continents. Coal and steel built the modern world. Then came electricity, telegraphs, and steel bridges. The world began to hum with invisible energy. For the first time, human communication outran the horse and the wind. A message could cross continents in moments. The world was shrinking again, but this time, it wasn't explorers who connected it. It was engineers. The Industrial Revolution also transformed life at home. Gas lamps lit city streets. Newspapers spread news and ideas faster than ever before. New inventions, the spinning jenny, the steamship, the sewing machine, reached even the middle classes, reshaping daily life. But while some grew rich, others drowned in the smoke of progress. Urban slums became symbols of both modernity and misery. The air was thick, the water foul, the streets crowded. Disease spread quickly, and the gap between wealth and poverty seemed unbridgeable. Still, something remarkable was happening beneath the soot and sorrow: consciousness. Workers began to organize. They formed unions, demanded fair wages, and challenged the new powers of industry. Child labor laws emerged. Cities built sanitation systems. Reformers began to see that the New World, if left unchecked, could destroy the very humanity that built it. The 19th century became a battle between two forces: progress and justice. And just as the Industrial Revolution reshaped society, it reshaped the earth itself. Coal smoke stained the sky, forests fell, rivers choked with runoff, the first signs of an environmental cost humanity had not yet begun to understand. But for all its destruction, the Industrial Revolution also awakened something extraordinary: a belief in human potential. Never before had so many people invented, built, and created so much in so little time. The same hands that once plowed fields were now building engines, bridges, and machines that could fly. The same curiosity that lit the Renaissance was now harnessed to steel and steam. It was a paradox, both triumph and tragedy. Humanity had found a new kind of fire, but it burned everything it touched. And yet, even in this furnace of change, art and beauty found a place. The Romantic movement rose in response, poets and painters who saw industrialization not as progress, but as a loss of soul. William Blake called factories dark satanic mills. William Wordsworth wrote of nature's fading purity. Artists turned to the forests, the seas, the mountains, searching for what the machine could not replace: wonder. Science, too, evolved. The study of nature became more precise. Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859, revealing that life itself was not static, but evolving, changing over millions of years, just as society was changing now. It was a revelation that shook faith, science, and philosophy alike. And while machines conquered the land, others conquered the sky and sea. Steamships crossed oceans faster than ever before. The first telegraph cables linked continents. And by the end of the 19th century, two brothers in Ohio were dreaming of human flight. The world had become restless. Empires grew richer. Colonies supplied raw materials: India's cotton, Africa's minerals, China's tea, feeding the insatiable hunger of industry. Europe, armed with steamships and rifles, carved the map of the world to its liking. The Industrial Revolution, once born in the coal pits of Britain, had become global. But beneath the smoke and steel, something deeper was happening: an awakening of thought. Humanity began to ask, if machines can change the world, what else can they change? Society? Education? Freedom itself? Reformers, scientists, dreamers, and revolutionaries began to believe that progress could be used not just to build wealth, but to build justice. The seeds of democracy, equality, and science, planted during the Enlightenment, now took root in the Industrial Age. By the end of the 19th century, the modern world had been forged. Cities glowed with electric light. Trains roared across continents. Factories beat like mechanical hearts. The future felt close enough to touch. But there was a whisper beneath the roar, a sense that humanity's reach was growing faster than its wisdom. That the same machines that built the modern age could one day destroy it. The Industrial Revolution had given humanity power over nature, over time, over each other. But as history had shown, power always comes with a price. And that price would soon be paid. The century to come would test everything humanity had built: its science, its reason, its machines, and its soul. The world had awakened. But sometimes, awakening is only the beginning of the storm. Part 15, The Age of Empires and Wars, when the modern world faced itself. There are moments in history when progress outpaces peace, when the speed of invention outruns the wisdom of those who wield it. The 19th century had given humanity machines, medicine, and knowledge beyond imagining. But in the shadows of this brilliance, something darker grew, the hunger for control, for dominance, for empire. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Earth was no longer a mystery. Every continent had been mapped, every ocean crossed, every resource claimed. The flags of Europe fluttered across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. Railways cut through jungles, steamships crowded harbors, and telegraph lines connected capitals like veins in a single, beating world. Humanity had conquered the planet, but not itself. The same energy that fueled progress now fueled ambition. Empires competed not for discovery, but for ownership. Britain ruled a quarter of the globe, its ships carrying goods, soldiers, and dreams of supremacy. France, Germany, Russia, and others followed, carving colonies into maps drawn by men who had never set foot upon the lands they divided. The world was shrinking, and so were the distances between rival powers. In Europe, nations raced not only to expand but to arm. Steel mills that once built railways now forged cannons. Factories that made locomotives now made guns. Science, once the servant of curiosity, became the servant of war. It was an age of contradiction. Cities glowed with electric light, yet workers starved in their alleys. The telephone, the automobile, and the airplane shrank the world, yet national pride tore it apart. Art flourished, ideas bloomed, and yet, beneath the surface, tension built like pressure beneath the crust of the earth. And in 1914, that pressure finally broke. The spark was small, an assassination in a distant corner of Europe. But like fire finding oil, it spread through the alliances and rivalries of empires until the whole continent was ablaze. The First World War had begun. It was a war unlike any before it, not of kings and knights, but of nations and machines. The tools of progress became weapons of destruction. Machine guns mowed down soldiers by the thousands. Poison gas drifted across trenches, silent and unseen. Airplanes rained death from the clouds. The earth itself became a grave. For 4 years, Europe devoured itself. The old world, built on the confidence of science and empire, crumbled under its own weight. When the guns finally fell silent in 1918, the world was unrecognizable. Empires that had lasted centuries were gone, the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, the Russian. The map of the earth was redrawn again, this time not by explorers, but by politicians sitting around tables. And yet, even in the ruins, there was hope. The League of Nations was born, a fragile dream that the world could find peace through reason, that humanity could learn from its pain. For a time, it seemed possible. The 1920s shimmered with optimism. Cities rebuilt. Jazz filled the air. Radios brought voices into every home. Air travel began to stitch continents together once more. But beneath the rhythm of progress, old wounds still bled. The peace had come without justice. The victors had divided the spoils, the defeated had swallowed humiliation. Poverty spread, economies faltered, and in the shadows of despair, new voices rose, voices that promised strength, revenge, and glory. By the 1930s, the world was drifting once more toward darkness. In Germany, Adolf Hitler rose to power, feeding on anger and fear. In Italy, Mussolini revived the dreams of Rome. In Japan, generals turned to conquest. The world that had sworn never again began to prepare for war again. And in 1939, it came, the Second World War, the deadliest conflict humanity had ever known. This time, the whole planet was engulfed. From the beaches of Normandy to the deserts of Africa, from the jungles of Burma to the cities of China, fire and steel consumed the earth. Tanks thundered across continents. Bombers filled the skies. For the first time, war was truly global and total. Civilization itself seemed to hold its breath. When it ended, in 1945, entire cities had vanished. The Holocaust had shown humanity the depth of its cruelty. And then, in a flash of light above Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the atomic age began, a single instant that split history itself. Humanity had discovered power so great it could erase its own existence. And in that moment, the world faced a choice, to destroy itself, or to change. The years that followed were uneasy. The war had ended, but peace had not come. Two great powers emerged from the ashes, the United States and the Soviet Union, and between them stretched an invisible line, dividing the world not by geography, but by ideology. Capitalism versus communism. Freedom versus control. The Cold War had begun. It was a war without battlefields, fought in shadows, in whispers, in space. Nuclear missiles stood ready to end the world in minutes. Children practiced hiding under desks. Spies traded secrets in alleyways. The human race lived on the edge of its own invention. Yet even as fear gripped the world, progress continued. The same technology that could destroy the planet also sent humanity beyond it. In 1969, as millions watched from living rooms and rooftops, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon. For a moment, all of Earth, every nation, every language, every faith, looked up together. It was proof that even amidst chaos, humanity could still reach for the stars. The 20th century was a paradox of light and shadow. It gave us antibiotics and genocide, computers and concentration camps, rockets and refugees. It was the story of a species that could build miracles and monsters with the same hands. After the Cold War, the world changed again. The Berlin Wall fell. Empires ended not with explosions, but with silence. The Internet was born, a new kind of connection, invisible yet vast, linking minds instead of lands. The age of empires had given way to the age of information. But the lesson of history remained. Every tool humanity creates, from the plow to the atom, carries within it both promise and peril. Every age of conquest ends with the same question: what kind of world will we build from what we've learned? The machines that once divided nations now connect them. The knowledge that once destroyed cities now saves lives. And yet, the same hunger, for power, for progress, for control, still lingers, whispering beneath every invention. The story of humanity has always been the story of balance, between creation and destruction, between reason and desire, between the past we inherit and the future we choose. And perhaps that is the quiet truth at the heart of all history, that every age, no matter how enlightened or dark, is a reflection of what we believe ourselves to be. The ancient empires have fallen. The explorers have sailed their last seas. The machines have quieted. But the journey, the quiet conquest of knowledge, of meaning, of ourselves, continues. Because the greatest frontier was never the oceans or the stars. It has always been the human spirit. And somewhere, in that stillness between progress and memory, the story of us goes on.